on Tuesday.
I'm not sitting here and telling you we're going to win. I'm not predicting that. What I'm telling you is the narrative about this election, about there being a red wave, there isn't one. There never has been.
I'm Ryan Lizza. This is Playbook Deep Dive. If you spend a lot of time on political Twitter, you have no doubt encountered Simon's tweets and threads over the last few weeks. He has built a large and loyal following of Democrats looking for silver linings amid the clouds of negative media coverage about their party's prospects in the midterms. Hispanics abandoning his party? Simon says that NDN's polling doesn't show it. Polling averages tilting to the GOP in the last few weeks? Simon says they've been polluted by a barrage of Republican polls dumped strategically to depress Democrats and excite Republicans. And that red wave? Simon says that if you look at the Kansas abortion referendum, the 5 House special elections earlier this year, and especially the early voting data, that the anti-Trump coalition that powered Democrats to victory in 2018 and 2020 is holding strong in 2022. I caught up with Simon at the storied Cafe Milano, a favorite Georgetown hangout for senators, congressmen, media types, and lobbyists. It's also just the kind of place that you'd want to go on a warm fall day to talk politics over an alfresco lunch.
Let me have the halibut. I'm going to get this pasta here.
Except for the loud rumble of machinery and trucks at a construction project going on across the street. You may hear that and a few other sounds of city life throughout the interview.
We haven't had a siren. We're almost there. We've almost checked every box.
Last week, we heard from a Republican strategist who made the case that a red wave is coming. Simon is going to give us the other side of that debate.
I have this very strong belief that the biggest question in this election was always going to be, would the anti-MAGA majority that voted in such overwhelming numbers in 2018 and 2020, 2 very high turnout elections, which we won by an average of 6.5 points, and Republicans lost the House, the Senate, and the presidency in those 2 elections, would that anti-MAGA majority show up again and keep the Republicans and MAGA from power, one more time, given that now the Republican Party has fully embraced MAGA as their new governing ideology, has shedded what we knew as modern conservatism for this new governing ideology. And the second question I always had was, because I wrote my first column about what we're all now calling the decoupling of the Biden approval rating and the congressional generic in November of last year, a year ago. I noted that there had been a decoupling, and that what I posited was that this was a bad sign for the Republicans because it showed that there was a MAGA hangover, that there was a resistance for all these people that had just voted against MAGA twice. It was going to be very difficult for them. They may be disappointed in Biden, but they weren't going to go running towards a radicalized extremist Republican Party, which they had just voted against twice, right? So I posited a year ago that this meant that this was not going to be a normal midterm and that the Republicans were going to have a hard time taking advantage of the disappointment in the Democrats and Joe Biden if that continued. So
they will split tickets. They will make a distinction.
Yeah, or just think about it this way. I mean, it means that you could be disappointed in Joe Biden, but no way are you going to vote Republican, right? And because they're crazy or they're extreme or whatever, right? So the
traditional indicator, presidential approval, is not necessarily the end-all, be-all number to tell us about the midterms.
And what I argued then, and what I've been arguing since, is that this was not going to be a typical midterm. That because of January 6th, because of Trump, because of MAGA, nothing is like it was. I mean, the idea that people were orienting themselves to believing that despite everything that had happened, this was somehow going to follow traditional political physics, when 2020 didn't even follow traditional political physics, right? We lost seats in the House while winning the Senate and the presidency. It's only happened one other time in American history, right?
Yeah.
Is that I just never believed in an age of Trump that things were going to follow traditional political physics, because he doesn't follow traditional political physics. And so the second big insight I had was that we did a series of polls in May of Hispanic voters in Arizona, Nevada, and Pennsylvania. And I sort of pulled the old NDN Hispanic team back together because there's been a lot of questions about what's happened with the Hispanic vote. And we just didn't know, and we wanted to learn. We were, old, so a bunch of my old colleagues that have worked on, as you may know, I was the person who introduced bilingual polling to the Democratic Party in 2002. I introduced Spanish language advertising to the Democratic Party. So I helped create our modern strategy towards the Hispanic community. And so I wanted to get data, fresh data that I could trust. And so we did a series
This is
of...
after a lot of a narrative that, and some truth to it, that the Republicans were doing better.
Yeah,
among
we're fleeing.
Hispanics.
That Hispanics were fleeing the Democratic Party is the way it's being represented, right? So, which I just doubted. I always had doubts about, because why, of all the moments to run towards the Republican Party, is the time when they're doubling down on racism and xenophobia and nativism and all the things that they were doing. And just as somebody who's worked in this community for 2 decades, I just found this to be an odd time for this to actually be happening. It didn't mean that it wasn't happening, but I just needed to learn more. So we did 3 polls, and what we found was Democrats outperforming our 2020 numbers with Hispanics in all 3 states, and our candidates doing really, really well. And this was completely contrary to the media narrative. And then I thought, if we're seeing this with Hispanic voters that are much more Democratic than is what people anticipate, what are we seeing with everybody else? And so I started spending a lot of time on 538, looking at the publicly available data at the time.
Yep.
And the truth is, a lot of people, I think, got caught in this election because there were so many late Republican primaries. There was a lot less polling than there usually is, right?
So this idea of general election polling.
Yeah, there was far less state-based polling, right? Where's Pennsylvania? Where's Michigan? Whatever, because there were very late primaries, and so there just wasn't any polling. So I think the media narrative and the political pundit class got very stuck on this idea of Biden approval rating down, inflation's high, red wave, right? There was universal belief this is what was happening. My polling showed that wasn't happening. And so I was like, whoa, what's going on here, right? And so I went and looked at 538 and found that of all the publicly available polling, Democrats were doing actually much better everywhere than was the conventional wisdom. And also we knew by the end of May, once the Dobbs decision got leaked, that we started seeing a new phase in the election where the mass shootings, the ending of Roe, and the radicalization of the Republican Party was going to get reintroduced in a very powerful way, potentially reawakening this anti-MAGA majority. And so I wrote a piece prior to Roe ending saying there's no red wave. You can't see it in the data. I didn't think it existed in the data. I don't think there ever was a red wave, by the way. And then what's really important for your listeners is we then had actual elections after Roe ended, not polling. And elections matter more than polling. And we had 5 House specials, and we outperformed our 2020 numbers by 7 points in those 5 House specials. And in Kansas, it was by 20 points. And in every one of those cases, the polling didn't predict any of this. And if you know, Ryan, because you talk to Republicans all the time, they all told us that New York 19 was in the bag, it was cooked, and they got beat by 2.5 points. And so to me, that was a sign that the election had really fundamentally changed, and we were in a very different election, and where Democrats were overperforming expectations, overperforming polls. And the question then became, for me, the next big question was, would that strong Democratic overperformance carry over to the general? We know Republicans are going to vote in big numbers. Will the anti-MAGA majority, will the Democrats vote in big numbers? That's the big question.
Yeah. All right. The post-Dobbs period and the special elections that provided such a boost of optimism for Democrats, and the period in the late summer when some campaigns were being advised, some Democratic campaigns were being advised to spend 80, 90% of their TV budget on abortion rights. I think most analysts do agree with you that changed the conventional wisdom dramatically. Every election analyst wrote a piece during that period saying Democrats could hold the House. All the Nates, everyone.
Trust me, yes, I'm aware of all this.
You were probably banging the drums, calling them, telling them to write it.
Yep, I was helpful in some of those stories.
But everyone agreed. I think there was a general agreement. And then what happened, and I think where you differ from the current narrative, there was a public polling-led change in the conventional wisdom when abortion partly because Republicans were very effective at abandoning the most extreme positions on abortion and putting Democrats back on their heels about whether it was a series of still high inflation reports or bad economic numbers, or just what a lot of people think was perhaps the end of that 99-day period where gas prices were going down. You had a change in the political environment again, which put people back into the full-on red wave narrative.
So look, I want to.
But you still are standing on the shore, not seeing the red wave, right? So that's where I think
that's where this gets really interesting.
That's where it gets interesting, and then there's the shift between the conventional wisdom and Simon wisdom.
Yeah.
I don't think anyone would disagree with your analysis of the summer, but why is everyone else wrong that things have changed again?
So let me start with this basic idea that the big question in front of us is, would this strong Democratic overperformance of our 2020 numbers
that showed up in the special elections,
5 specials races as disparate as Alaska, Nebraska, New York, Kansas, right?
Right.
Would that carry over to the general election? And one of the things we know is that post June 24th, the voter registration numbers, where we have that information, showed a dramatic change in becoming far more female and far more young across the entire country. This was a wave, if you want to call it. I mean, I hate that term, but it's what term everyone's using.
Yep.
Showing, and what that's an indication of is intensity, right? So there were indications that this intensity that we saw was carrying on, but just in a different way, right? And remember, the New York 19 special was not all that long ago, right? It was just, it was just a few months ago. It wasn't 6 months ago. It wasn't a year ago, right?
Okay. Yeah. Sure.
And the DCCC polling in that race had us losing by 3 to 4 points, and we won by 2.5 points. And so we were overperforming our own polling, right?
Yeah.
And so the question I have, and I think the question that's unresolved, actually, is...
Just one question.
Yeah.
And usually when you're overperforming your own polling, it's because your modeling is a little... Your modeling is probably
too
off.
Republican.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Fair.
Right. And even our polling, as an overcompensation for what happened in 2020, a lot of the Democratic pollsters have been, putting a lot of Republicans in our samples because we didn't want to get burned again by the shy Trump voter or whatever happened in 2020. Right?
Yep.
So the shy Trump voter theory is this dark cloud hanging over the entire Democratic, establishment, right?
Yeah.
And frankly, for many reporters too, who felt that they got too far out there and they've been very conservative, which is, I think, another reason why the red wave thing became very comfortable for a lot of people, right?
Yeah.
So I think that I'm going to say 2 things. So one is, I think a lot of political commentators got very invested in the red wave in the spring, and were not happy when there was no longer a red wave. And I think there was pridefulness and there was political reputation issues involved in this. And so I do think that a lot of people in our business have been desperately hoping the red wave came back so that they didn't look like they blew their election commentary, right? And the second, and so they've been looking for red shoots, right, as opposed to a wave or whatever you want to call it. The second thing, and by the way, I've been here for so long that I just don't care anymore, right, about any of that. Right now. And so the second thing is that I think the question about whether or not the strong Democratic overperformance would show up in the general election, I think is now an open question. I don't think I have a different take on the way you phrased it. Is that it's not? I just don't think we know, and here's why we don't know.
Fair.
And what I'm doing
so
is
a lot of what you're doing is pointing out that this is still a strong possibility, and here's some evidence.
Well, and the evidence is pretty overwhelming, actually.
Yeah. All right, let's go through that.
Yeah, I mean, let me go through that. Is that so? And I actually put out a newer version of it just this morning.
And just I think the most important thing we can do as journalists, our job should not be to predict. It should be to offer the range of possibilities.
Right. And I'm not predicting anything.
We like to predict one thing.
Yeah.
Red wave, no blue wave.
Yeah.
It's much more, makes a lot more sense to inform listeners and readers with the range of possibilities.
Right, and I think that the idea that the Democrats had this very strong overperformance has been sort of wiped away from the collective memory of journalists, and
that's no longer within the range of outcomes.
Right, that happened before, like 3 years ago, right, as opposed to like 2 months ago, right? And
totally fair.
Yeah, and so I think the open question in front of all of us now who are looking at data is what is actually really happening in this election, and nothing. By the way, I want to be very clear that I've just followed the data. Like, I don't have an opinion about an election. This is my 17th election cycle working in Democratic politics. I've been on both sides of waves and been on winning presidential campaigns, losing presidential campaigns. I know what it's like, right? And the key is that every election's unique, and you've got to the way to understand what's happening in an election is you have to follow the data of this election, not assume that it's going to follow traditional political physics, which is the most lazy kind of journalism possible, right?
You mean just to say it's the first midterm?
Yeah, whatever.
And so he's going to lose?
Come on. I mean, it was just silly, that kind of commentary. I mean, every election's unique. Every election has its own contours. I mean, even the issue around there being a dearth of traditional polling over the summer was one of the things that made this election different, right? And even some of my dear friends, people who I've been talking to for 20 or 30 years, I think sort of took a very lazy path. And in an age of Trump, you can't be lazy, right? Like, everything is different and new all the time, right? Like, we're dealing with a very different kind of world that we're living in, right? So, long story short, here's what I see today.
Yep.
What I see today is that the strong Democratic overperformance we saw is carrying on to the general election. And I don't think there's any dispute about that any longer, because we now have.
What's the best evidence for that?
Yes,
right now?
The best evidence of that is that we have a mountain of early vote data. 30 million people have voted. So
I have to tell you, the early vote stuff. As soon as I hear early votes, I think about being burned like a million cycles.
That's okay.
Because the early every time I
know, but let me explain.
Do you know how many times the early vote analysis has been? I don't want to. This is
That's
just
okay.
a rant I have.
Yeah, but that's okay.
I always ignore. Ever since I forget what cycle it was, I just.
That's okay.
As soon as I see someone start to say early vote, I'm like, you know what?
I know. I'm aware of this.
Anyway.
Trust me. I'm aware of this dynamic. And because
I'm sure you've been burned by it too.
No. But I'm also. But the point is that where we have to get back to this very simple thing is that what is an election about other than people going to vote? And what you want more people to vote for you than for the other side. And so what's happening is, for all of us election analysis, a lot of people are voting. So what are we learning from that? I'm not saying it's predictive. No one's saying that.
Yeah.
But we have an immense amount of information about what's happening in this election. And we also, because early vote has been expanded, we actually, early vote now is a much bigger percentage of the overall election.
Right.
And what's been interesting to me about this election, because every election's unique, is the data has been remarkably consistent for the last 2 weeks, right? There hasn't been any big spikes or big changes, either nationally or in states, which means that there's a pattern, right? The pattern is consistent. And here's what we're seeing, that Democrats are overperforming 2020 in almost every major battleground state, and in some cases by a substantial margin. So just if we go back to put it in perspective, as of this morning, looking back at the exact day 4 years ago, Republicans had a national vote lead in the early vote of 150,000 votes. We have a 3 million vote lead today. So this is a completely different midterm than the last midterm, right? Again, it's unique. Why? Because Democrats have really embraced open early voting. The Republican Party was the party of early voting in the past.
That of course is the main response to this argument, is that the two parties are now completely polarized on this issue.
Yeah.
It's become an article of faith among Republicans that somehow showing up on election day and voting is the only thing that is patriotic, constitutional, and anything less than that is somehow heretical. Even though, in places like Arizona that have a long tradition of early voting, and other places where Republicans had these incredible early voting programs and vote by mail programs, Donald Trump has just wrecked them.
He's wrecked it, which was bad for the Republican Party. And
so why isn't that just the main explanation of all the early vote?
Because if Republicans are so energized and they're so fired up and ready to go, why aren't they voting? And so
They don't trust early voting.
I know that's a speculation.
Yeah.
That could be.
Got it.
Right? I mean, you're now in the guess world. You're not in a data world.
Yeah.
We got to look at the data.
Yeah.
What the data is showing us is what is an election about? Getting more people to vote for you than the other guy. Right now, we're doing really good at that. Yeah. Actually,
Yeah.
we have 3.2 million more votes,
Yeah.
than we had 4 years ago at this time. I'd rather be us than them.
So
right?
to come back, let's put this in perspective. To come back from the deficit that you're seeing in the early votes, say this continues for the next week,
Yeah.
Same trend line. What does election day have to look like for Republicans in these states?
So let me go down
Is
on
there
a little
way
bit more data just to help people understand, to paint the picture of the moment. It's not the election, it's the moment in the election, right?
Yeah.
6 days out we are. Democrats are overperforming compared to where we were in 2020, not in 2018. So in a polarized election,
Yeah.
and in fact, the national vote is remarkably similar in percentages to what it was in 2020. So this election is looking a lot like 2020, which is an election we won by 4.5 points, right?
And by percentages, you mean the early vote?
The share of the early vote that's Democrat and Republican.
Yeah. Just so people understand that, in states where there's both a big early vote and partisan registration.
No, we're doing
you
this
can
off
get
of
that
modeled
data.
partisanship.
Got it.
And so modeled partisanship, the way for your your listeners to understand, is simple things like, do you vote regularly in the Republican primary? Then you're a Republican, right? And so there's ways in the business to model partisanship based on voter behavior. And Target Smart, the firm that has the most comprehensive site, compares this day to 2020, this day to this day in 2018.
That's Tom.
Tom Bonnier,
Yeah.
who I've been collaborating with
Yeah.
in this fun journey about the early vote,
Yeah.
trying to get people to take it
He's
seriously.
the other half of this team of optimistic apostles.
Yeah.
Apostles of optimism.
Well, it's interesting
But his
about
data-
Tom. He's not optimistic or pessimistic. He's a data
No,
guy, except the data's optimistic, right? That's the thing. So, and here's what we've learned is that in many of the most important states in this election, this is where Republicans, so if there was a red wave,
Yeah.
you would assume that Republicans would be outperforming 2020, meaning just doing better than 2020, not
Yeah.
2018, right? 2020. And right now, Republicans are below their 2020 numbers at this point 2 years ago, 6 days out. So it's an apples to apples comparison because it's
Yep.
the polarized Trump distortion of the mail and everything
Yep.
else. They're down in Georgia, Iowa, Michigan, North Carolina, New Mexico, Nevada, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Texas, Virginia, and Wisconsin. What's also important to recognize is that Democrats in those states, which are most of the important states, are overperforming our 2020 numbers like we did in the House specials. Same thing, right? Like we saw in Kansas, same thing. Like we saw in my polls in May,
So
same thing. But let me finish then. And then in current polling of high quality Senate polls, not the garbage Republican polls being dumped all over our system, Democrats are outperforming Biden in current polling in Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina, Iowa, Ohio, and Pennsylvania.
Outperforming Biden.
Biden's final number, his results. So we're overperforming in polling in the battleground states. We're overperforming in the early vote. We overperformed in the elections before. And what you see is a pattern of overperformance. What you also see is a pattern of underperformance by the Republicans. And if the Republicans were so fired up and they wanted to go knock us out, right? Why are they under 2020, right? And that's the problem for all of this analysis about assuming that the Republicans are more engaged and ready to vote when the data is actually showing us the exact opposite from that.
So this is what you would expect to see if the special election data were
Carried over.
Carried over.
We're seeing exactly what we thought we would see if the 5 House specials in Kansas data carried over to the general. It's overperformance. We're overperforming everywhere. There's only like 4 states in the country where we're below, where Republicans are outperforming, their 2020 numbers. So this data is scary to them. Michael Steele, former RNC chairman, reached out to me last night and said, "You're right to be who's an anti-MAGA Republican."
Of course.
Reached out to me and said, "You're right to be promoting the early vote data. They have no answer to that, and it's a huge problem for them."
What's been the response that you take most seriously from Republicans about this data? Or to ask it another way, what worries you the most?
Well, let me give you just one other confirming set of data, right? The second thing is we have had the most recent youth poll done by Harvard IOP, the Institute of Politics, showed they found vote intent for 18 to 29-year-olds to be at or above 2018 levels, and us leading by 25 points. The electorate so far is very old. Those people haven't been voting that much. If they
Young
voted,
people have not.
Yeah, the younger voters is down, particularly younger Republicans, by the way. Younger Democrats are down a little bit, but younger Republicans are way down. And if that youth vote, as Tom Bonnier keeps saying, is the big question that remains, is how much of that youth vote comes out in the next week. If it comes out on a high level, CBS News predicted in their recent study they did, if youth turns out the way Harvard says, Democrats will keep the House and Senate. That was CBS said that, not me, right? So that's another thing in our favor.
CBS said that based on their last poll?
Based on, you know how they do this modeling of the House? They actually created a separate model for high youth turnout that had us keeping the House and Senate. The third thing I want to say is that we now have gotten a lot of Hispanic polling, high quality Hispanic polling from Univision and Telemundo, and also some of the national polls. All of them show us doing better with Hispanics than we did in 2020. All of the polls show us doing better. And in places like Arizona and in Nevada and in Texas, we're doing much, much better than we did in 2020. And so that's another sign that of overperformance, right? If you keep going down the list of overperformance, right? And then to me, the biggest tell today of all was Mitch McConnell's final ad buy, where 3 of the 5 states that he's choosing to play in are Republican-held seats. 2 of them are North Carolina and Ohio.
This was like the last almost $30 million.
That is a sign of Democrats overperforming.
So
in
no
the Senate
stretch
races.
states in that buy.
There's no stretch dates, and that's a sign, again, of overperformance. And so what you're seeing is, in all of this data, right, you're seeing overperformance by the Democrats. There's a clear pattern. We're doing better than people expected. We're doing better than the polls had indicated, right, that some of the dirty, dark polls had indicated. And so when I look at all this, I think that, hey, look, we're going to have a good election. I don't know that we're going to win, right? I mean, it's going to be really close. But the idea that Democrats were going to stay home, that's not happening. I mean, we're voting at incredibly high levels all across the country, even with an older electorate. And so, you know, what's happened is that the way to think about this is that a lot of our older prime Democrats, the people who vote in every election, they voted right away. Right?
Banked those. Those are all banked.
Right, they banked. But and one of the things that's really important for your listeners to understand is that this thing you hear out there, well, you're just cannibalizing your election day vote, right? That's not a thing. And I want to dispel that myth. That's an urban myth. What happens in a campaign...
What does that even mean, cannibalizing your
So the whole premise
vote?
is you're just taking your election day vote and moving it early.
Yeah.
But what happens in reality, not in the fantasy world of right-wing talking points, is that when you do that, you're then freeing your massive campaign operation to go turn out lower propensity voters.
Right. My job on the campaign is to turn you and Adam out here sitting at this table. If I've done that in October...
Right, or let's just use today, right? We're 6 days out.
Yeah.
It means that Democrats are hitting lower propensity voters now.
Right. Now I get assigned to someone who's not so likely.
Republicans will start hitting them at 2 o'clock on Election Day afternoon. So what's happening now is because so many of our, what we call prime voters, have already voted, which was the goal, by the way. This was the plan. And the DNC spent $75 million building out these field organizations that are producing unbelievable early results for us all across the country, right? This was a plan. This was not an accident, right? We knew there was going to be early vote. We have pushed it. And the reason we've embraced it is it means that we have a week now to turn out episodic and irregular voters as opposed to one day. That's a better way to win an election than what the Republicans chose. And so we feel really good about this early vote. It's very encouraging. I'm not sitting here and telling you we're going to win. I'm not predicting that. What I'm telling you is the narrative about this election, about there being a red wave, there isn't one. There never has been. It's never actually shown up. It didn't show up in the House specials. It didn't show up in Kansas. It isn't showing up in the early vote anywhere in the United States, right? And what we are seeing is continued Democratic overperformance. What I think this means is that this is a very competitive election. It's really close. Yeah. And I think we're going to win a bunch of races that people didn't think we were going to win, and they're going to win some too, right? To me, one of the most interesting dynamics is you are seeing a big change between, you know, the states where we're running ads and have these massive field operations as opposed to states like California, Oregon, Rhode Island that don't have the same level of investment. And that's where we could see some underperformance, surprising underperformance.
Right.
California, we're under. Early vote is a little down.
Yeah.
It's down in Oregon, right?
So non-swing states, non-states without big Senate campaigns.
That didn't have this big spend and this big campaign, where we were able to more control the information environment, and frankly, where abortion mattered more than in heavily Democratic states, right?
Yeah.
And so that's the case for optimism.
Yeah.
What I just went through with you is why I'm sitting here 6 days out and can say with you is that I don't really know what's going to happen next week. What I do know is there is no actual red wave. A red wave may come. It hasn't come yet. And in fact, what we've seen is that we've seen repeated, ongoing Democratic overperformance in every way that you look at the data. I don't think people really understand. Let's just take Pennsylvania, right?
Yeah.
The Monmouth poll today had Fetterman up. The New York Times poll had him up 5. Let's just say he's up 3 to 4, right? Just to average sort of the good polls. Biden won that state by 1 point. That means we're doing 2 to 3 points better than 2020. In Arizona, we won that state by 0.3%. Kelly's up 4 to 5 points in most of the major real polls, not the fake polls. And so what we're seeing is, even in the polling, we're overperforming 2020. And certainly McConnell's super defensive endgame here suggests that they don't have it in the bag and that they're actually worried. The other reason I think they're exhibiting fear and worry is in the way they've gamed the polling averages. There's been an unprecedented effort to flood the zone in 7 states.
All right, so this has been one of your more controversial takes.
Yeah, and I'm happy to explain
Because
it. Yeah.
I think when some people hear this, they think, all right,
Conspiracy theory.
He's the, remember the unskew the polls guy from a few cycles back?
Yeah, that's fine.
But
That wasn't me.
So, no, I know that wasn't you. So I'm being facetious, but explain your view on this. Your view is that the polling averages are being
Manipulated.
are being manipulated.
They're being manipulated by Republicans. And it's just obvious, it's like sky is blue stuff. More than half of all the polls taken in October in 7 states are Republican polls. And at that point, nobody can trust the polling averages. I mean, historically, the way this would work, Ryan, is that in October, there'd be 1 Democratic poll, 2 Republican polls, 3 media polls, right?
Yeah.
There weren't 12 Republican polls. Signal's done 5 polls in Ohio in the last 3 weeks, right?
Yeah.
And what you see, all you have to do is to go to 538 and just look at this. They jumped 3 polls in Pennsylvania last week showing Oz up by 3 points. The same number, by the way. All 3 of them had 48%. Boom, boom, boom on Friday. Okay, the election's changed because of the debate. And then everyone else's polls showing Fetterman up, right? And so, look, I do this for a living, right? I know what they're doing. and it's clear that there was a campaign, a very expensive, multi-million-dollar media campaign to pollute polling averages to make the election look closer than it really is. Why would they do that? That's a sign that they actually don't think they were winning.
Your argument is it was to change the narrative, positive news feeds,
Right. Well, go back to negative, positive sentiment that we were discussing earlier.
Yeah.
It was
if your guy's winning, it jazzes people up, it gets them motivated.
By the way, we know this from data.
Yeah.
Like, there's actual data about this.
Like when Karl Rove in 2000 said they were going to California.
Right.
Because he had this view that, if you look like a winner, you'll be a winner at the end.
We know from studies, if there's more positive sentiment in a race, you get more money, more volunteers, more enthusiasm. So what they were trying to do, going back to my comment at the very beginning, is they were trying to create more negative sentiment for Democrats, which has worked, by the way, because a lot of media organizations have bought into the fact that the red wave has returned. Virtually every interview I do now, the interview is starting from a very dark place about Democratic prospects, right? And so they've actually been very successful in creating massive amounts, probably tens of millions of dollars of negative sentiment at a critical time in the election. And so what I will just say is that I didn't know what was going on.
Dampen Democratic enthusiasm.
To bolster their troops, right?
Yeah.
Rick Scott's going out there saying, we're going to win 52 seats when obviously McConnell's buy doesn't even contemplate that, right? They're just gunning up and just doing what they do, which is the party of the big lie, lies about elections. That's what they do, right? What I would just say is that there's no question the Republicans could win the House and Senate. But I would rather be us than them right now. And where I sit, and when I look at the data that I see, I'd rather be going into Election Day with 4 or 5 million votes in the bank than being down. I mean, look at John Ralston, right, who's revered as a political analyst and journalist. I was on MSNBC with him the other night, and I talked about this early vote. And he said, I agree with Simon. Everyone should be ignoring the polls. What matters now is the early vote. People are voting. That matters much more than the actual polls.
And he's seen that in Nevada. He's seeing big Democratic.
He knows that just from the experience of being in a single state, how much the early vote actually is a window into what happens on Election Day. It's not a predictor. It's a window. It's a prism. It's a suggestion, right? It's a trend.
Yeah.
And so what we're seeing in the polling just in this week, there are a lot of the polls that have been negative. We've had some bad national tracks in the last couple of days. There's no question about that. We had very good national tracks last week, and that's why there hasn't been this sort of progression. I mean, things actually got really good for us last week. We had really good Senate polls. We had good national tracks. The majority of the national tracks last week were plus Democrat. A majority of the likely voter polls last week were plus Democrat. The Politico Morning Consult poll that came out today was +3 Democrat, right? So there is...
That's the second week in a row.
Right. The data's not all pointing in the same direction.
Yeah.
And that's why, unless everything's pointing in the same direction, you don't have a trend. And there's conflicting data to the red wave meme. And so I think that what I think is going to happen is that the Republicans are going to have a very good election day. There's no question about it. But we're having a really, really good early vote, frankly, better than I think any of us anticipated. And so there's a lot of confidence on our side that, we got a shot here.
Fair. All right. Very persuasive. Let's talk a little bit about the issues and the issues that both parties have tried to make the campaign about in the final days. The Democrats are back to a pretty traditional Social Security, Medicare, populist economic message with a heavy dose of warnings about what Republicans will do if they take power. I don't really think the election has been, maybe you disagree, nationalized on either side.
This is the most important thing that we've talked about so far.
But let's talk about that. If you could wave a magic wand and get Democrats to all talk about the same thing, what would it be?
Listen, it's a great question, and I think one of the things we didn't talk about, and I have a group of folks who I talk to about the election all day long.
Yeah.
And one of the things we've
You're
been
probably on Michael Podozer's
No, I'm
list.
actually not. I'm in a different group.
But okay,
and
anyway,
so,
he's got the same view of you in terms of the anti-Trump majority.
No. He and I have and I actually haven't spoken to him during this entire period, right? It's interesting. He came to a very similar place as I did, just looking at data, right? And so I will say this issue, Ryan, I'm really glad that you raised this, because one of the things that my little group has been going back and forth on this morning is this actually an election that wasn't nationalized? Is this actually defying all of our understanding about how modern media works, where this isn't actually a nationalized election, and where you're seeing, Democrats doing a little bit worse in blue states and a little bit better in red states, and the fact that the Senate Majority PAC went up so early in their advertising, and also all the grassroots investment we've made, that we've basically created media environments in these battleground states that are unlike the media environment in the rest of the country, right? Because it's not a presidential election.
Yep.
And so we actually could be seeing, and this is one of the most interesting things after the election we can talk about, is this actually a non-nationalized election?
Yeah.
Which is almost, for those of us who believe in sort of modern media, it's almost inconceivable that could happen.
Right. The thing with the cliche these days is everything's nationalized.
Right.
Mayor's races are about big national issues, whether you love Trump or not.
Right. And so what's happened is that it's possible that this is actually not a nationalized election. I think the Democrats chose purposely not to nationalize it.
Was that a mistake?
I don't know.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I don't.
But if you're Abby Spanberger in Virginia, maybe that's what she wants.
No,
she wants a local election.
No. There was clearly a strategic choice by the Democrats not to nationalize the one right?
Yeah. And one of the things that this Dan Constant, who was on last week and runs the McCarthy Super PAC, if you listen to that, he made the point about how localized some of the races in it, and that was one thing that the national media was missing. And some of his ads were so specific. It's a piece of Oppo research they found about a Democratic incumbent that it's nothing to do with like some of the big national issues, and they just hammer them. In an environment where tell me if you think this is correct.
We're doing the same thing, by the way.
Of course. That's right. So what you're saying is neither side has really tried to nationalize it.
I think that they've tried to nationalize it around
Biden
being a failure, but we learned from the decoupling that wasn't sufficient. I mean, look, I think one of the things that you have to wrestle with, and in the interviews that you do, is let's just say the election became a couple more points Republican like 3 weeks ago.
Yeah.
What happened? Russia and Saudi Arabia raised gas prices in the United States. Gas prices didn't rise. there was an intervention by hostile foreign powers to aid the Republican Party in our election. And I think the awful reality of the fact that we now may be in our second election in recent memory where a political party comes to power having been aided by the Russians is sort of an awful reality that we're going to have to work through over the next few years. And I think it's just reckless and irresponsible of journalists to not make this connection. I mean, inflation just didn't go up. Gas prices didn't just go up. They were raised by people who wanted to actually dramatically intervene in weakening the coalition against you in Russia, right? This was a geopolitical act, right? Not just a spiteful act. And so,
do you think there was a previous time in American politics where Republicans would have been as outraged by that as Democrats?
yes. And it's outrageous to me that Ronna Romney McDaniel gets up every day and blames higher gas prices on Joe Biden. She's doing Vladimir Putin's bidding at that point. She becomes an aiding and a willing abettor to the genocide that's happening in Ukraine when she does that. And the entire Republican Party has become an aiding, witting abettor to the genocide that's happening in Ukraine. And whether they understand that or not, it's just an absolute reality, because what they're doing is they're deflecting the blame from Putin for raising gas prices and raising food prices and all the other things that he's been doing, preventing the American people from understanding the nature of the conflict that we're in. Going back to this thing we've been talking about. There's a lot of things about MAGA that I understand deeply, that I can be sympathetic to, right? I may not agree, but I can be sympathetic to. The adoration of Putin is not one of them. And it's been the piece of their evolution as an ideological force that remains, to me, one of the great mysteries. That I don't think it's actually easy to understand or explain that. I often hear people say, well, it's because Putin's a Christian nationalist and everything else. But he's none of those things, right? That's all fake and false, right? He's, one of the worst actors in human history.
I think for a small set of white supremacists, there was this connection between Russia and that group. In the larger Republican Party, like you, I don't really see the
I think except their performance on what happened. Look, the Republican Party has been overtaken by extremism and extremists, and I think that what happens if they win either chamber or both, what happens to our political discourse, what happens to our democracy. I don't like the term election denier because it's far too benign, because it's like saying that we didn't win World War II. It's far more malevolent, because when you're an election denier, you believe that the Democrats are criminals. They stole the election and they should be put in jail. And so it's a tool of radicalization, right, and mobilization. So I have not really spent much time thinking about the implications of election deniers being elected and what it means for our long-term democracy, because in some ways it's so depressing that I need to stay positive and stay upbeat. But I think that the awful reality of what's happened, the radicalization and extremism of the Republican Party, is far worse than is understood by the general public. The threat to our country is real and present in front of us. And it's why, frankly, I've been working so hard to try to win the election, because I think this is not a normal midterm. It wasn't a normal midterm for the political reasons we discussed. It's also not a normal midterm because our democracy may be severely weakened. The Republicans may weaken the ability for us to prosecute the war in Ukraine. I mean, a whole set of really dangerous things may happen if they win. And so I don't view this as a typical midterm, and it isn't. And the stakes are higher than usual, which is why Simon has been tweeting like a madman for the last few months.
Well, on that, a more pessimistic note than you're known for right now, I want to say thank you for your time and for offering an alternative to a lot of the conventional wisdom out there. It's a good way to do our last show before Election Day. And we're going to have to gather after it's all over and sift through the results.
And let me just end by saying that one of the most interesting responses that I've gotten, and there have been many from people that used to be friends of mine, I think, is the notion that the early vote doesn't tell you anything. And as I tweeted this morning, how could it be that analyzing 30 million votes is somehow not instructive or informative to what's happening in an election when an election is about people voting? And I think that these sort of casual dismissals of the significance of the early vote has been among the laziest and stupidest things that I've seen any prominent people say during this entire election cycle.
Yeah.
And I'm disappointed. And my other disappointment in the media and the pundit class is that we know the Republicans are flooding the zone, right? We know this is happening. I shouldn't have been the one to call it out. Nate Silver, the person who actually did call it out, let's be clear, was Nate Cohn on Monday in the New York Times, openly discussed the flooding of the zone. He used the term flooding the zone, which is the term I've been using. I think he stole it, appropriated it from me, it's fine. But Steve Kornacki and Nate Silver and many other people who do this for a living should have called out what was happening, because it was unprecedented. There's never been dozens and dozens and dozens of polls being flooded all at the same time by a bunch of unnamed, unheard of pollsters that we've never, in organizations that nobody's ever heard of. It shouldn't have been me. They had a responsibility as journalists and people who are on television who are instructing the American people about the election. They should have done it. And I'm really disappointed in a lot of the people that I really admire and look up to, frankly, to get guidance from them about what's happening in our elections. I've lost some of my own personal faith in the integrity of this entire process, to be honest. And we have to figure out how to restore that for the health of the country.
All right, Simon, thank you very much for your time.
Ryan,
But
it's
I
great to
also-
see you, by the way, after all these years.
I know it's been a while.
I know.
No, it's been good, but you're
Yeah.
always up. You're always up to something, so it's always
Yeah.
interesting to chat. Every cycle, you've got an
Yeah.
interesting project. So even if we're not,
'Cause I get bored easily.
Even if we're not constantly talking, I'm
Yeah.
following what you're
Yeah.
working on. But wait, just one final thing, and we may or may not include this. As someone who talks to a lot of Democrats, what's your view of the structure that Biden will use to make this decision after the election? Do you think the success in the midterms makes it more likely that he runs again? A much larger loss than anyone's predicting means he retires? What's your view of what he's going to do and how he's going to make the decision?
I've always believed that the more successful he is, the more likely it is that he'd retire,
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
because he goes out a winner. And I think that the fact that he was able to get so much legislation passed means that it's more likely he doesn't run again, because he cemented his legacy. If he still had things he needed to do,
Yeah.
then he would have fought and potentially stayed on. I don't know what he's going to do. I think it's
Yeah.
a tough decision, but it's his decision. And I think that Democrats are going to give him a lot of space to make that decision. I don't think he'll get challenged in the primary. I would be surprised.
Well, Bernie Sanders has said he's supporting him, so that seems to be a pretty good endorsement to have in his
Yeah,
pocket.
I think
Any
that
challenge is going to come from the left, right?
No, it also could come from governors. I mean, I think it could come from people who are not
think-
part of the Washington world that's close to Joe, right? Who's known him for 30 years. There could be governors. I won't name any of them, but
I mean, you're talking. Newsom is the one that's obviously made the biggest splash recently.
I think it could be somebody who's not tied to Washington that
Yeah.
could make a challenge.
Is Newsom
so
in
it's
that
not it's
category?
not an ideological challenge. It's some other insider-outsider challenge. There's a-
Generational.
Yeah,
right,
generational.
right,
I think that there becomes a different,
Yeah.
and I still think there's a high possibility that happens, but we just don't know. And I think
Yeah.
a lot will depend on what happens over the next few weeks, what happens with the war, what happens with the economy. I mean, if we start going into significant recession early next year, it's going to be much harder for him to run.
because it will be harder for him to prevent a challenger.
His
or
approval
because-
rating will go down so far that he just becomes vulnerable. And I don't know that that's going to happen, but I mean, my own view is that the scenario that probably makes it likely that he gets challenged if he